Welcome to Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum's In Conversation with Judith Yanez. I'm thrilled today to have Judith with us. I think it's a true treat, and I look forward to introducing her. For those of you who don't know, Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum is a nonprofit organization based in Northwest Arkansas that its foremost task is incubating the fashion industry in Arkansas. However, we also focus a considerable amount of our programming on representation, equity, diverse programming, and truly being dynamic and meeting the needs of our constituents. So in that realm, it's worth knowing that Judith has been a roommate of the Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum for the last year. Her organization, Rooted NWA, has split an office with AAFF, and we have found a significant amount of productive overlap in terms of conversation, in terms of constituency, and just a real treat for us to know. So without further ado, Judith Yanez is an advocate for culturally responsive spaces that strengthen parent voices in Northwest Arkansas and nationally. She graduated from the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville with a degree in mathematics and a Master's of Arts in Teaching. She is currently the founding executive director at Rooted NWA, Rooted Northwest Arkansas, the National Parent Union Council member, and the first Latina elected official in Northwest Arkansas, serving as Justice of the Peace for Washington County District 4. Prior to founding Rooted NWA, she served as the Education Program Manager at the Cisneros Center for New Americans and a mathematics teacher at Springdale High School and Haas Hall Academy. These experiences have allowed her to meet hardworking immigrant families, like her own parents, that did not have an education beyond elementary school, resources, or support to make intentional and strategic decisions for their child's education. Rooted NWA, the organization, is a nonprofit that stands with the notion that a parent is the primary facilitator of a child's education. By providing an environment that empowers parental voice through education, options, awareness, experiences, and personal growth, parents are able to make intentional and strategic decisions benefiting their child's lives. Judith, welcome.
Robin, thank you. You know I would not do this for just anyone, because having these conversations you have to be very vulnerable. And so just working with you and the respect that we've earned for each other, and that space we have provided for each other to be vulnerable, you can't find in this area, especially with, the dominant culture. So
yes.
Let this speak of your own ability to create space, and allow me to be vulnerable, because this is scary. And so let me just be authentic. I had to record this twice.
Yeah.
Okay. And I spoke to Robin and I was like, Robin, I was the kid that just listened and I was spoken to. And so now I have to be the voice of a community. And so your brain is not wired to speak impromptu.
Mm-hmm.
And then from experiences, I've said things that, people would need to come back and ask clarifying questions because they're part of my culture, but they don't. And so they find ways to misconstrue my words. And so I appreciate you for letting me record this. And I'm going to be extremely vulnerable right now. And I want to set some boundaries before we begin.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And I want to, I'm good at boundaries, but I want to do that because I want to model what it's like to listen, but to also create that space that often does not exist in this area. Okay, so it's very important. And so this is why I'm going to be vulnerable today. And so people can gain insight of how to create that space. It's very important. So my number one rule, assume good intentions. I'm not here for any gain. I'm here just that we're open and vulnerable to have these conversations in Northwest Arkansas. That we begin to do that inner work to create change. Unless we do the inner work, we're not going to create the change that we need for communities. If anything I say triggers you, offends you, you don't understand, and you go to where, she's, just talking because she's talking, ask clarifying questions. What did you mean by this? I would love to know more about this. Become curious, because that inner work requires when you're triggered and you get upset with what something says, you have to understand why. So this work begins with understanding why and asking questions. and then listen to understand, not to react. So when you watch this video, you have questions, you get offended with anything I say, let's begin that conversation. And that's my intention today. So thank you, Robin.
Judith, thank you. That was beautiful. And I appreciate your candor in admitting that this is the second take. And I think that that's actually really useful for people to know because, but I wasn't going to mention it. But it is, you know, these conversations, one, often don't come naturally, and two, are difficult and deserve extra time if needed. And so for me, you know, we do two kinds of programming. One is live, one is pre-recorded for the exact reason of this is a one-on-one conversation between you and I that is hopefully a brave space is what we like to call, but at the same time is meant for a larger audience to absorb. So if we're not hitting the information that you want to be getting into the world, we're not doing our job right. So let's begin base level. Thank you for setting boundaries. I think it's really brilliant for the audience to also understand that they're coming in with these boundaries. They're understanding that if you get triggered by something Judith is saying, write down your response, sit in it, think about it. Don't immediately react, right? Give yourself 45 minutes, come back to it. Get to the end of the talk. Something else might clarify that later. And I think that we should do that more often when we start programming. So at the very beginning, can you define culturally responsive for us?
Yeah. I want to share a book with the audience that we're not taught the language or how to articulate oppression or culture. We just live it. And each one of us makes sense of the world through that culture. And it wasn't until recently that I read this book, and I'm going to show it on the screen. Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. So if I might be vulnerable, I read the first chapter the first time and I cried. For the first time, my existence in an education system and how it failed me was validated. What I needed was not provided. And so when I talk about the definition of culturally responsive, I'm going to source this book because it articulates it beautifully. So again, each one of us makes sense of the world through our own experiences, our own culture. And so there's different levels of culture. So I'm going to define culture first and what it means, okay? There's surface level. We all celebrate Cinco de Mayo. Tacos, food, we know it, surface level. You don't have to do any work. You know, sometimes we get hidden with, I'm inclusive because I go eat at certain spaces. You know, I love tacos, I'm inclusive. That's surface level work. The second thing, we get a little deeper with this, and this is where the inner work comes in. Shallow culture. So when you walk into a space, you're going to notice behavior patterns. There's certain cultures that don't look you in the eye. You know, you have to walk into a space, you take off your shoes. You're still able to see that, but how well are you able to read the room? That's important. Here's where we get a little deeper, and it's called deep culture. The things that you cannot see. These are collective unconscious that you have to, beliefs and norms, how we make decisions, the concepts of yourself, your worldview. And worldview is important because it continues to guide our behavior. And sometimes we don't notice our behaviors being guided by our view. We just do what we do. And so let me give you an example. Like if you travel abroad, we're gonna know where we're gonna eat. We wanna know what kind of music the country has. We will know that stuff. Then you go into the spaces and you understand, oh, they don't shake hands. They don't, and this is very important because you have to pick up the patterns. And the pattern's just not one person. I usually allow 3 people. You know, like I see my pattern in threes. I see it once, I see it again, and then the third time it's like, I get it. So you walk into rooms, what are the patterns that you're seeing, the cultural norms? And then the third, when you go into deep culture, that's very individual for each person. That's where it gets hard because we have to see each individual as an individual person when their own behavior patterns, their own belief systems. And so that's a lot of work, right?
So I am curious. You did give me notes that I can dig in. We're curious, and I think that I'm curious. This idea of deep culture, I've actually not heard that term, and I really love it. And I just want to ask, where do you think, in terms of shallow culture, deep culture, where do we, on the spectrum in Northwest Arkansas, where do you see us usually engaging as a sort of, let's call it cultural field? You are in education, I'm in arts and culture, so, of the two fields.
So here, it all has to do, and for me, has to do with your own awareness and the inner work you are wanting to do. So it's important with the work in Northwest Arkansas, and you might notice this. What is the social political structure of any environment?
Mm-hmm.
What is oppressing people? And if you don't come
Mm-hmm.
at it in every decision that you make, analyzing that,
Mm-hmm.
that's the first level of awareness, the things that you're able to see, the patterns that you're able to pick up in any space. I don't see many people, those are hard conversations to have in Northwest Arkansas. Because you're saying, hey, your structure is oppressive, this is a pattern, and it's a pattern for a lot of people, and that requires inner reflection on what's
Mm-hmm.
causing that, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, and as far as your question, where are we in Northwest Arkansas? I think this is very individual for each person, but
Mm-hmm.
I have not found many, I'm going to call brave, where I can be brave and have these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to find in Northwest Arkansas, but we have to look at implicit biases.
Mm-hmm.
Each person attitude, these are unconscious. These are unconscious
Yeah.
and requires a lot of work. Each person has attitudes and behaviors that shape their responses to different groups. And you're not able to tell your unconscious bias unless you do the inner work.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to hear me say a lot in this talk, and it's my favorite word if you know me, inner work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? You have to become uncomfortable. And Robin, that we have a lot of comfortable spaces when we speak
Mm-hmm.
about DEI,
Yep.
diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have
Mm-hmm.
beautiful talks. We get out of there like enthusiastic. Let's get on with this. Let's support community.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This true culturally responsive requires you to do the inner work, and it is uncomfortable. If you do not leave a space questioning, triggered by what you heard, you're not truly being culturally responsive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's the one thing that across the board at any space in Northwest Arkansas, that people are not wanting to get uncomfortable and
Mm-hmm.
have these discussions and reflect. And you mentioned something, the triggers.
Mm-hmm.
When something triggers you, you need to write it down. And, it comes, maybe you can't get a thought in your head, but your body feels it.
Mm-hmm.
Your body feels it. Take note of it.
Right. What did that? What prickled your spider sense?
And it's fun. I have this thing that once you start questioning something,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like once you buy a car and then you're able to see that car everywhere when you would have noticed it before.
100%. Yeah.
So once something triggers you and you're like, why did that trigger me? I kid you not, you're going to get another experience and experience that again.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see the pattern and you're like, oh, now I understand why. So triggers are very important. You need to write them down and be able to sit in that uncomfortableness and be able to step back and not analyze it until you're fully getting all the information.
I think it's really, I think it's, yes, I think it's really important, and I'm glad you bring it up, that, and that we can talk to the audience about this a bit, that in that moment where you have your reflexes raised and you feel like, whether it's anger or annoyance or denial or whatever sort of harsh feeling comes in, that's okay. It's okay that flooded in. You don't have to let it take over. Let it wash over, right? Let it go away, and then come back and say, why? What was so out of the blue or out of the norm that with that interaction that caused me to have this set of feelings? So I think that's really useful. But I want to go back to you. You say look for the patterns, and I would like to know, what are some patterns that you've seen here in Northwest Arkansas?
So there was a major one that happened to me last year. So I encountered this difficult situation. I don't want to go into this, what the situation was, but so I suggested to a public leader, you need to go into the community and identify why they don't trust your public structure. Like, listen to them, look at the patterns. So the response, and this was like really like shocking and eye-opening, but it was my beginning of the trigger to start seeing the pattern was, that's a lot of work. Who's going to do it? And that is a pattern that I see in Northwest Arkansas, that we do not want to go. So like, one of the things is I'm fearful to go have this conversation with this group because I'm afraid to speak about race and so for me, it's like, so you're not used to working with different cultures other than yours. Mm-hmm. And you have to go in there and see what's triggering you. Like, that is important for you to be culturally responsive. Go into that culture and understand what's triggering you, because otherwise, like with all that's happening in the world, if we're not listening and understanding other cultures, we're not going to create change. But in essence, what I was asking, now that I know that I'm reading and investigating and research culturally responsive, I was asking him to be culturally responsive.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Rule number one, go in there and understand. And it's a lot of work, but we must do it if we truly, like, we bring up this word of being inclusive. If we're truly being inclusive, you have to go in there and be uncomfortable and listen to our community. You have to be culturally responsive. And so then after that conversation, again, like I mentioned, you start seeing the patterns everywhere else. Your mind gets aware. And I don't know the psychological term, but then you just start noticing that pattern. And it's everywhere. You will notice, if you think about it, like as a nonprofit, if you need to reach out the Latino community, are you going to go in there and go reach out the community on your own? We often ask for someone from that community to do the outreach. And that's not being culturally responsive for me, in my opinion.
You're right. I mean, even with Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum, when we initially begin trying to make relationships, we often find, unfortunately, one person and say, can you help us, dive deeper? Now, I do think it's worth noting that having one person who can introduce you to other people who you can then dive in with there's nothing anathema about that. It's okay to start somewhere. You don't have to just walk into a room of people you've never met and try to figure it all out. But you can never stop at one person. You can never put the weight of an entire community on the back of one individual and say, okay, well, we've got our Latinx participants, so box checked, right? Because that's putting an undue pressure on somebody every individual has brings their own stuff to the table. So sussing out whether this is one individual's stuff or if this is communal stuff is, it's not fair to put on one person. But you said something that I actually want to dig into a little bit, because it's something that we don't talk about very often. And this could be a very useful time to sort of get it out in the open. You mentioned, not feeling comfortable in these kind of DEI environments to speak out, to be more vulnerable, to express yourself more sort of fervently. And that's something I hear over and over and over again from our community participants. And on the other side of that, what I hear from people who are organizing this DEI work, or people who are at the executive director level or the, community engagement level, well, we created this space and they didn't say anything. We created this space and they didn't tell us what to do. So, and then they kind of throw their hands up and say, we don't, so we tried. And I think that we have to know that first encounter, nothing will come from. You're not going to get anything in that first encounter. You might not get anything in the first 4 encounters, but like keep going. But do you have any advice about what kind of framework allows you to feel generous in sharing?
Usually when I walk into those spaces, I'm sitting at the table, I look around, of course, yes, I'm a white passing Latina. I am, and I get that. But my brain process is of an oppressed Latina. But I'm sitting in that table and I look around and the dominant culture is in that room. And they're all excited about being there. And so you often feel like you have to be the teacher, like you're the token person at the table and you have to be the teacher. And it's exhausting because if I'm going into that space, I want to find things that will make me feel better, validate my existence, that will make me feel that I'm not teaching someone and that I'm going to get something out of it. So when I'm going into that space, I'm not getting anything out of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then you have that pressure that you need to talk about your own experience because that's we're brought into that room because you have to have diversity of thought. But and a lot of us are used to doing the inner work, the material that's being given is not material of inner work because that's uncomfortable. And so we're afraid to push boundaries. And that's usually what I feel in those spaces. We're afraid to push them. And we have to be fearless in this intent. Even the presenter has to be vocal, make the audience feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And then the spaces that I've been that happens out of Arkansas, the transformations and the unity that is built in that room is beautiful. I'm yet to experience that here in the area, but because we find common ground with our stories, with our struggle, and those environments here do not provide that space.
There's a cultural anthropology term that is way outdated, but I'm going to throw around because it has been useful for me. But the idea of the native informant. The idea of the native informant is you go into a cultural anthropology, and like, this is problematic, but going into a setting of a community that is not your own, from a dominant culture, and pulling one person aside and saying, tell us about everybody else, right? To what's going on? Tell us about everything else. It creates its own substructures of cultural misunderstanding and interpersonal misunderstanding. And then it also sets that person apart from their own culture, which becomes problematic for them, becomes problematic for interactions between them and their community. And I see us in Northwest Arkansas getting stuck at that level over and over and over again. That sort of like the tokenization of the native informant, like, come in, tell us your secrets, right? And it can't be that. It can't be that because what we want is the integration of so many more touch points, right? True inclusion would be reactive across both boundaries, right? People from dominant culture having access to people from the non-dominant culture and vice versa. More people from non-dominant cultures in Northwest Arkansas being at boardroom tables, being in these discussions, more than one in the room so that there's some bargaining power, right? Talk about like collectivity. If there's more than one person from one community in a room, then they can at least bond with each other, turn to the side and say, don't you feel this as well? And I think that that's something that I just wanted to get out of this. Because I think that's worth knowing for people as they go about their DEI journeys.
Yeah, but I do want to mention something, like being the first Latina elected official, like I hold a lot of first roles and in tables where the dominant culture is still dominant. There's this, I'm authentically myself. I will be authentically myself because when I go into those rooms, I want to normalize what it's like to work around people that are different than you. And what I found myself doing previously to this was assimilating myself to the need so I would not like cause any trouble, to please people, like understand where this person was coming from so I could assimilate myself to their need. And so now I'm like, nope, I am me. And I need to normalize that there's different people in this community.
I appreciate that so much. There are a few women in the area I know that have taken this actual strategic tactical stance. And I think people don't understand that this is a chosen tactical stance of saying, I'm not going to round the edges on this. I am not going to make the edges fuzzy and sort of make you feel better. I'm going to come in with all my problematic statements. And I have people contact me a lot and say, like, what about so-and-so? What do you think about so-and-so? And I'm like, you have to understand that what they're doing is almost performative. And it's so necessary because it's making you feel like you have to call me and ask, what about so-and-so? Well, the answer is like, they're doing the job of ruffling your feathers, which is, you should thank them for that ultimately, right? Rather than sidelining people who are making this kind of, John Lewis's good trouble, right? Bring them further in because that's what we need to change things up. So yes, I think that's beautiful. Thank you. So let's talk about rooted. I think zero humans could doubt the passion for your work. I've seen it. I know that everybody who's interacted with your organization has seen it. So where does that passion come from?
It's interesting because I think whatever you want to believe in, God, the universe, whatever, it was like you purposely going to live this life experience because this is your legacy. And so it was like understanding, and this is really passionate, so I'm going inside right now. Education separates families. I came from an immigrant family. My majority of my childhood, my parents were undocumented, high poverty. And, I'm going to say this statement, and I've gotten slack for this. I grew up in the hood where you take care of your people. Your people are hungry, you eat. You feed them. You feed them, you protect them. And this is not talking about gangs. If you heard me say, I'm from the hood, and you look at me, and a lot of the feedback is like, you don't look like someone from the hood. You're pretending to be from the hood to be like this strong person. I would ask you to sit back on that and analyze if you received a trigger from me saying that I'm from the hood. But education separates families. And I saw it in my own family where my parents were not able to navigate education with me. I was left to chance. I don't know how I got where I am. I'm trying to identify that. But a lot of parents just send their kids to school and trust the education system. And my son said something very amazing. He goes, your work with parents is important because parents are the ones that push their children to have a bright future. But when they lose the power to education systems and then they're separated and are not able to be a parent to that child and make decisions, and as a child, I was the quiet observer. I didn't speak much. I was a quiet observer, and a lot of my classmates would trust me with their most, intimate trauma that they experienced. And so sitting in the classroom with hearing their stories, I would see how classroom and education settings would affect them. And there's two experiences in mind. One, when I was in elementary, there was a young man that had just moved from Africa. He confided in me with a situation that happened in his household. And he came to school very angry. Of course, child, unable to process what had happened. He got suspended from the anger. There's another, when I was in high school in California, a young man that I saw that was involved in gangs, brilliant in math, science. But in order to survive in his community, he had to be this strong gang member. And he was killed by a drive-by shooting. And so here with COVID, I've been able to reflect a lot of why I do this work. And can you imagine if those families lived in different neighborhoods? If those parents knew that a possible environment where their child could have been themselves instead of surviving in neighborhoods, how would that change their lives? And I carry that deeply because this work is highly political. But I truly believe that we need to take families from your child will become successful by chance and you won't know why they became successful. This is my story. Okay. And it breaks my heart.
Yeah.
It breaks my heart. We need to take that into parents are making intentional, strategic, they have a voice. Because they want to be able to say, and the child should be able to say, my mom did X, Y, and Z for me, and this is why I'm here. But we fail to give parents that voice and that power. Again, highly going in there deep, but
no, thank you. You make a point that I think is really worth pulling out, which is, how can you replicate what is perceived as a random set of circumstances, right? How can you replicate the luck of one individual to make it out of any oppressive environment? And you can't. And so if we really want to start breaking down the barriers to entry for all individuals across all of cultural divides, we've got to create systems that are replicable, because people need, there are cultural norms that people follow that get them where they need to go, right? And white dominant culture, it's unspoken, but everybody knows, you go to school, you study for the SAT, you go to college, you do an internship, you do blah, 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 right? There's all of these normative steps you go through, and then you get your job. And, those are unspoken. We know them from elementary school on. We know where we're pointed, right? And if we're not creating similar ladders, they don't have to be the same ladders, but they have to be ladders that are identifiable. And I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that's something that we can't expect the dominant culture's mode to success to immediately translate onto everybody else. Situations are different. So creating something that's better than luck.
And it goes back to being culturally responsive. White dominant culture, your cultural reference frame is your culture. Mm-hmm. And so you have to go in and do the inner work to be able to see how the other culture functions and go beyond luck, right?
Yes, absolutely. So you've received opposition for your work. Can we talk about it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Two things. Educators that really focus on families and, fight for families, there's two things that we know. Is that children deserve learning environments where they can be vulnerable, open to failure, validated, become curious of the learning process, be served with dignity. We know that is important for education and learning to happen. The other thing that we believe in is that parents deserve to be active participants in the decisions and then have a voice in their child's education. We know that we cannot make education better unless we have parents there supporting the learning, but also speaking up on issues that are happening with education. When we talk about implicit bias, when you're in a school, that school develops cultural norms. That school has a cultural identity. We're stuck in the ins and days and ins every day. We need parents to help us see what our implicit biases are in those environments. And so I have friends that are complete opposite ideological frameworks than me in education. And I had one that question, I'm not sure why we're friends, but we stand with families, and we know where our hearts are. And no matter our views, families come first. So here's what I've noticed, because I'm going to always go back and look at the pattern and always understand what do I need to reflect on? I'm not a stranger to the inner work. Am I doing something wrong? Am I serving families correctly? And so, but one of the patterns that I've noticed with opposing views is that we believe that this education environment is going to save all children. So I'm going to go back to the culturally responsive of the deep culture. We have to look at each person individually and how that environment affects that child. And are they truly going back, children deserve this learning environment where they can be curious about learning? Is that happening? And so parents deserve to have that decision. That's up to the parents. That's up to none of us to decide that for a parent. That's where Rooted comes in. It's like, here's the information. You know your child. We're going to give you agency. We're going to give you the resources and information to put your child in an environment where they're going to be happy. Because as parents don't know education and they struggle through that oppressive structure, they do know when their child's happy. And that's where we give power to people. And that's why I love this work. And, I'm open to discussion, come oppose my work. But if you're not willing to have that conversation of how we're able to make education better for all children, I'm going to just set that boundary.
How do we get more parents involved in their child's education?
Difficult question. And we ask this, we have a group of Rooted mothers. I love them, beloved Rooted mothers of mine that have been for the last 3 years part of the organization. And they come from all different education settings. So we have traditional school, charter schools, independent. And I wish we formed more environments like this with educators, because they're able to support each other no matter the education system they're at. They're there to support their children's education and then brainstorm with each other of best practices. It's beautiful. But what makes a parent like that be engaged? And because they haven't been engaged before and the environments are not culturally responsive to welcome families, we at Rooted have to model what that parent looks like so parents can see themselves in those parents. Because there are scary systems that haven't welcomed you. And we have to model what that looks like.
One thing we believe at Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum is that representation truly matters, like more than I think we give it credit for, because what I have seen, and I think what you're speaking to is people look for examples, right? People look for leaders to follow. And if there is not an example that people can feel comfortable walking behind, nobody comes in. And so, what I love about the Rooted Mothers is that it's not one woman, it's not two women, it's a group of women who are self-modeling this ability to engage in education and to advocate for themselves collectively. But they're also showing back to the community that it doesn't take some exceptional human. It's these moms, not set apart from society in any particularly, in any particular way. And, you probably too can enter into this and participate in this kind of advocacy for your child's education. So I think that's really important, is just showing people back to themselves so they can self-identify into your system. I say that all the time. Show them themselves in your system so they can project their consciousness into that. They can ideate what would it be like to be there, and that maybe opens the door for them to walk through. So yes, agree.
Yeah, and I want to make another point though, Robin. We don't listen to the stories of our parents. We don't give them the space for them to tell our stories. And we do. I mean, Rooted is, every practice is guided by listening by parents and their needs. But if you were to meet some of these moms, they're superheroes to me. We have one mom that fled her country because of violence, domestic violence. I mean, was almost going to get killed. Traveled 3 countries with her child alone. And this is, I could not do this. Like I put myself in her shoes, like I'm strong, but girl, you're my hero. But she says she came here and the education system just devoured her. So can you imagine someone with that strength and just being an oppression through these education systems? And so we have to realize that be culturally responsive to understand that once that trust is lost with schools, these families have trauma and they need a safe space. And once that trust is lost with schools, these families deserve an environment where their child can be safe. It no longer is about education. The child's not learning if they don't feel safe. Parents deserve and their child deserve to be in schools where they feel safe.
I think that re-emphasizing your point about once you've lost that trust, once you've lost it, that, you've lost a lot of options. You've lost a lot of optionality. And I think that one thing that organizations in the area are not being proactive about enough is approaching community building with a sensitivity that allows for the development of trust and protecting that trust as if it were the most important element of all the things. I said to somebody yesterday, like, it's easier to build a building than it is to build a community, right? You can build a building anywhere. There's a real easy, you just need some building stuff. To simplify, building community is a precious, hard process that involves the creation of trust. And if you break that trust, out the window. So I appreciate you speaking to that. And building trust takes a long time. And to go back to your quote, the pattern you brought up earlier, that sounds like a lot of work. Sounds like a lot of work. So at Rooted, what specific ways do you practice being culturally responsive?
Okay, going back to the deep culture and implicit biases, I come from the community that I serve. I'm going to come with my own perspective from my own experience. I'm going to come with my own trauma, my own baggage. But is that the reality that's happening? Or am I saying, oh, because I lived this, that I'm going to generalize it to the whole community? So I'm very careful, and we are going to expand to other communities. And I'm so excited about that. But I want to explain why we initially started with our Latinx community. So coming from the community that I serve, I had to be very careful of listening to parents and understand the patterns. Like I said, most of the time programming in the area is going, oh, this is what I believe the community needs, so we're going to do it. And we don't step back and actually listen to the voices that we're serving. And for us, it's parents. So initially for the 3 years, it was just listening to parents and kind of like, okay, we saw the need, let's provide something for that need. In a nonprofit, it's that term mission creep. Okay. And so I had to do my own inner work to understand my story, how I got here. I was constantly triggered by the stories of families because I could put myself. And so then I started taking note, this is triggering me. Okay, this is triggering me. And then when it comes with people of color, because you grow up with trauma and then you have ancestral trauma that you have no clue where it's coming from, you have to do your inner work or else your own biases are going to influence the work. So what we did, and we partner with the University of Arkansas Department of Education and Counseling or Health Services, and Dr. Anthony Baja helped us do a research on our mom group. So we were seeing this, but because we're the lived experience of the community we serve, is that truly what we're seeing, or are we projecting onto these families? So he helped us analyze the data, and that's going to come out soon. I'm so excited about that. And then we hired a consultant that has surveyed parents to understand what their needs are. So again, I can say, here are their needs, but being from the community that I serve, am I projecting? And I keep saying that because people don't understand the inner work that's required, because your vision is limited to your capacity and your perspectives. So I have to constantly push myself to be uncomfortable, to grow, because I want our parents to have high quality high caliber programming that their children deserve. And so we're soon here going to develop a strategic plan on how to like serve the Marshallese community. And that's going to require, again, a lot of work to get in there and understand. Now that I've done my own inner work of going, here's what I bring to the table. Here's my own cultural frame that I bring, and know how I'm processing the information. So that way I'm really getting information on how to be culturally responsive to that community. So it oftentimes we're like, we're going to serve all this demographic, you know, the Marshallese, our Asian community, our Marshallese community, but we're doing a disservice unless we are culturally responsive, going, again, our implicit biases, and then the deep culture of the communities that are not seen, and you have to go in there and understand them. So our work is truly culturally responsive, and I would not have it any other way.
You said something that struck me as kind of profound, and I'd not ever thought of it. Is it somehow more difficult to work within your own culture because you are constantly being reminded of trauma that you can identify into? I'd never thought about that, but do you think that might be the case? Do you think maybe when you begin working with the Marshallese community, it may in some ways be easier because you won't be constantly self-identifying into it? Or
I think it's both. I always say that community leaders have to do their own inner work, or else trauma will enforce trauma.
Mhm.
You're trying to save someone because you've gone through it, you know what it is. But unless you process that trauma, you don't, like I said, by luck or chance, I'm here. So you're leaving your work to luck and chance of supporting people. And we need to create change. We need to be strategic. I am doing this because I've seen a pattern that it didn't just affect me, it affects other families. Or I didn't see the pattern and that's the way I see it. Like, you have to be able to differentiate between that. Now, for me, I don't know if it's harder or easier to go into another community, because I work really sensitivity of understanding behavior patterns that are attached to culture. So I already have that inside view of my own culture, and I see a family, I'm like, oh, I know why that behavior pattern exists. Or is that just that family, or is it, you know, for the whole community? So going into, let's say, the Marshallese culture, I'm going to have to identify all those behavior patterns, cultural norms, and then also identifying, and am I projecting based on my own racial cultural frame onto this culture? It's a lot of work, and people, you know, I was called out. It's like, why don't you work with XYZ community? And it was trying to explain this, that in order to be of service and have impactful work, you have to be culturally responsive. And that's a lot of work.
One of the things that I appreciate, I think in the last year, you and I have had a similarity in our programming, in that you focused very heavily on engagement with Latinx mothers and their relationship to their children's education, and you didn't try to immediately branch out to all other non-dominant cultures in the area. And we had written a program that we thought we could do outreach to the Latinx community and the Marshallese community simultaneously, and almost immediately found out there was absolutely no way we could do that properly. So we tabled developing any programming specifically for the Latinx community, because we wanted to get it right with the Marshallese community. And we feel that we've gone a long way down that road, but there was a lot to learn. And it was really important for us to say, okay, let's actually put much more thought into this, so that if we take our eye off the prize for a second, it doesn't immediately disintegrate, right? And that's because that is that loss of trust, and it's hard to rebuild after that. So I appreciate watching you. You gave me a little bit of a permission slip. watching you model that, I was like, okay, it's okay to keep your head down and try to do one thing really well before you branch out to all the other things. And I really look forward to seeing how Rooted grows into other communities. And frankly, we'll be watching intently to find patterns that are working. And so bringing it back to patterns, what patterns have you noticed in terms of cultural responsivity with local nonprofits? Like, what are you seeing?
Going back to, this is a lot of work. And when you have a nonprofit, I've luckily been given 3 years to really dig deep on being culturally responsive. Like, I'm grateful for that. But nonprofits have to produce outcomes. And so one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm very passionate, I hopefully get funding for this, side note, check, just putting that out there, is helping nonprofits build their own relationships with the communities. Like, I want my parents to say, Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum exists, and they provide this information. And Robin has built this environment where I feel welcome going. And Robin no longer needs a partner to help her reach out to the community. Like, our parents deserve to have, and I'm talking about our rooted parents, because our children deserve those experiences. Those families deserve the experiences, but we're relying too much on partners. And think about COVID, those partners shut down, and usually those partners are schools. So you go into a school and schools automatically have this diverse group. So we have to do that work of building that relationships ourselves with that community, because that's how we understand the cultural norms. That's how we're culturally responsive. That's how we're going in there and discovering how we need to build our programming to be inclusive to all families. And I would love, that's a dream for me, because I worked with it through Rooted, and I saw the deep work that we're doing with families and how it's changing lives. And I think all nonprofits that service that, families deserve to have that same connection.
I think what you mentioned, I was actually just talking yesterday about something you mentioned, which is that the developmental stage of an organization in which collaboration is absolutely necessary with other organizational entities to get to your end goal, and the growth that you have to go through to surpass it, especially when doing cultural outreach. So just to make that make that sort of abstract concept concrete, when we first started working with the Marshallese community, we ran everything through Melissa Leylon at Arkansas Coalition of the Marshallese, because she was our point of contact and we respected that dynamic. And it took quite a while for us to get to a place where we were interacting enough with the community that I felt comfortable talking to Melissa and saying, I'm not going to go through you for everything. And she was very pleased to hear that, because she has plenty on her plate. She has plenty on her plate. And, so it's actually knowing when to move away from partnerships, because you're adding additional work to an organization that's already serving a community. So it's like getting yourself stood up enough that you can confidently contact a group of people and say, we've created this space for you. Please come into it. But it doesn't happen overnight, and it's a real dance, right? It's a real dance of like, is this space essentially, has it been vetted by people who are more often connected to the dominant culture, the sort of executive director level of the dominant culture, and has it been approved? And it's a unspoken thing, right? There's no report card.
I love that point, because I'm often asked to collaborate, and I had to work really deep on this one, is what are my values? And I'm not going into a space where I have to do all the work, and if I have to speak up of something that's creating discrimination in an environment and they're not willing to hear it, because what has happened is I get blowback. And so now I'm very intentional. Okay, you want to collaborate with me? Talk to me about your work. What have you done previously to, be inclusive to families? And no one can fake it with me, because I like to ask those hard questions. And if you know me well, it's like I'm very direct with those questions because I want to see your response. And is this going to be an environment we can work together to serve families, or am I going to have to tiptoe around the conversation? And we can't tiptoe.
We're getting to something that I like. We're really hitting something that I think feels really productive, in that you've got to lay the foundation. As an organization, you've got to do the work to write the program, lay the foundation, create the structure, show it to the community and say, what do you think? Can we try this? Do you think this might work? Rather than saying, come into my structure and build it for me. Because frankly, that's insulting. Frankly, it's insulting on so many different levels to say, I don't want to spend the time building a program that won't work. So I want you to come in and tell me how to run my organization for you. And I don't think people are really processing that you've got to put the legwork in, write the program that's going to fail. It's going to fail. Absolutely. Something about it won't work. Go ahead and write it, right? Go ahead. So people can say, oh, this is the space you've created. This part, I don't think sounds pleasant. Can we take this part out? And it's almost like things have been done too casually for too long, and it's to the detriment to the non-dominant culture. Like at this point, the non-dominant culture deserves contracts, agreements, working, like statements of purpose, because people's intentions need to be codified, right? And so that really triggered my spider sense. So I appreciate getting to that.
Yeah, no, one last thought. Like, let me, this one is, if our families and our communities are an afterthought, that's usually what happens. To be honest, they're afterthoughts. We're thinking through our cultural frame. This is what we need. Oh, wait, how do we include these other communities? And that's going back to being culturally responsive and like understanding the systems that oppress people, because we have to be very in tune to that. How are we oppressing families? How are we being inclusive to our families? Like, those are the hard conversations that we have at Rooted. Like, are we discriminating against anyone? Like, we have to check our own biases all the time. But often what happens, communities are an afterthought. And when I see that, and let me just be really direct, when I see that, it's like, I'm done. I'm not here to do the work for you. Yeah.
And I appreciate that about you. I think that it's, I hope that we as organizational leaders can be modeling behavior for other people who are interested in getting into this kind of work on both sides of the conversation. That's why I wanted to have this conversation with you. I think that I have an immense amount of respect for the angle that you come into your work at, and the authenticity of saying, like, I'm not, there are things I will say no to, right? We're not desperate for you. Right? We don't, and I think that that's really important. So thank you for joining us for this. I know that this was, I've wanted to have this conversation with you for a long time, and it's not easy to make sure you're hitting the points correctly. So is there anything else you want to add?
No, and I'm glad, because, I don't hit the points correctly because I don't know how to articulate what I've gone through, but let me be vulnerable enough. Any culture, go in there and study, and then you start building your language. You start building your language to articulate and then have conversations. It's scary at first because it's very vulnerable, but it's needed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Judith.
No, thank you.
I can't wait till the world comes back online and we can do this in person.
And I can give you a hug. So thank
I
you, Robin.
know, I know.